running out of space. We're going to try and give it a chop right about there. As suspected, it suffered no difficulties. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, sword friends. Someone was very kind to donate part of a Christmas ham to the channel, and we are going to try and carve the remaining parts of the in-bone Christmas ham with swords. Let's see what happens. So as mentioned, what we have here is an in-bone section of ham. This has been pre-cooked at least once and then refrigerated and reheated. So this is not vital bone, nor is this raw, dried bone. The properties of cooked bone, it's not exactly clear how much it compares to living bone. It seems to be perhaps closer to living bone than raw, desiccated, dried out and ossified bone, but it's not going to be perfect one-to-one comparison. In addition to that, this is porcine. This is some type of pig bone. Pig bone is not perfectly analogous to human bone. Again, what type of cut it is, the proportions of it. Pigs develop differently. Pigs develop only, reach maturation over only a handful of years compared to humans that take 16, 18 years to develop. So the deposition that goes on in the bones is different. That said, I suspect that this is going to behave much closer than many of the other mediums that we use for testing swords if we're trying to figure out what is going to happen when you strike something that's bone-like. This is going to behave much closer to living bone than many of the other things that we test. It does have some meat left on it. This is cooked meat, which is very different, obviously, than very squishy uncooked meat. So it's going to, that if anything is going to retard the action of the sword going into it. It is going to be closer to, something like hide or thick layers of gambeson than typical flesh. So keep in mind that whatever's going on with the meat on there, and there's not as much as you'd think. So originally I thought that this was just a piece of femur. I can see a round of bone sticking out here that's approximately 2, maybe 2.5 centimeters across. As I've felt around, almost all of this has bone in it. So I'm not exactly sure what cut of meat it is. I'm not a huge meat eater, so I don't recognize this particular cut of ham. I suspect that this might be part of the pelvis, so there may be some of the sacrum in there. It may just be that this is the distal head of the distal end of, or the mid end of the femur, and that this is the proximal head of the femur, and as a result is much larger, and it's just been cut right through it, and so that's why it's so big at this end. So we'll find out. So I'm starting off with the longest messer. You'll note, before I talk about the sword real fast, I have it suspended on a string. Then I have another string running down to it and a kind of light weight on it. So this is free swinging rather than, many cases people will have a target like this sitting on top of a stand where it can just be knocked off or rested completely against something and then whacked into. I'm trying to avoid either of those. This is going to have the opportunity for it to move. If I didn't put this anchor on here, this anchor is mostly to prevent it from swinging and going all the way over or swinging out of frame. I'm still a little bit worried that it's going to deteriorate or possibly cause chips, so I'll put on some extra protection once we get moving. If this gets cut and it falls, that's fine, so I don't have to worry about that. But this will offer some resistance. Now again, remember, if we're talking about something maybe equivalent to a limb, lower limbs are usually under load and a lot more static. So if you were to strike, for instance, a leg, that leg often will offer resistance to the blow and be pretty firm and resist the blow, whereas an arm, the lower arm in particular, often will yield to whatever type of a blow to some degree, depending on if the arm is going up and your blow is coming down, or vice versa, if you're chasing the arm, etc. The upper arm is closer, it's anchored to the body, so it's a little bit more resistant inertia-wise. So this it's a little thicker. It's actually, here it's very thick. It seems like it's almost solid bone there. If that's solid bone, then we're talking about, almost 3.5, 4 inches of solid bone. You're talking about 10 centimeters of solid bone there. That's a lot of bone to go through. But from a target standpoint, this would be more like striking a lower arm that might retreat from the blow, rather than striking a leg that's just going to have to sit there and absorb the impact. My idea is I'm going to start my strikes initially kind of light, and I just want to see what a kind of light strike does against it, to see if it can get through the meat and just cause, whether a little mark or a gouge or a chip, and see what it does, rather than my very first strike going all the way and bisecting the target. If it happens, it happens, but that's not my goal. Initially, I want to just see if I can start making little inroads into the bone. Hopefully I don't destroy my sword, and then I'll ramp up the energy until hopefully I'm able to cut all the way through, possibly up in the upper portion. It narrows. It seems like we have a kind of conical shaped bone. So again, I picture that this up here, I'll bring the camera over real fast. So we have the open end of what I assume is the center portion of the femur, and then it just gets very wide, and there's actually 2 bone segments down here, but this whole portion is solid and feels like bone. So I'll get at the structure. I don't know exactly the anatomy that I'm dealing with of the pig here. So I'll start with we're going to start the experiment with this, the Gottfried from Langsknecht Emporium, which is medium weight. It's pretty nimble in the hand, and it has a secondary bevel. It is pretty sharp. So this is, I don't have anything else to cut it on, but this is pretty much paper cutting sharp, and it makes short work of things like bottles. So I'll expect to give it a pretty, it should clear the meat fine. If we chip an edge or damage it, that's fine. But I'm very curious to see how this does, and I have a couple other swords if this is unable to go through. So let's see what happens. Running out of space. I'm going to try and give it a chop right about there. I am not going to try and chop the meat all the way through. I'm going to try and give it a 30% power chop and just see what type of damage it causes to the bone, etc. All right, safety first. I don't want anything splashing back and bouncing in my face. Let's see what we've got. I'm going to just do an Überhau like that and see what happens. Clang. So I can see exactly where I struck the messer. It made a lovely cracking noise. That was about 20 to 30% chop. You can see exactly where it struck on the messer. All those lovely ham juices. And we left a devastating wound. So this is very thick meat, but let's take a look at how devastating the wound was. Take a look at that. So now I have a lot better idea of what the structure of the cut is, and we can see that it is pretty much solid bone. And so I didn't even, because it came in at a 45-degree angle, it went through the long way. And so I have penetration reaching about 2.5 inches, so 6 to 7 centimeters. You can see we're going very, very deep into the bony structure. So that wasn't particularly hard, and this cleaved through some of the thickest type of bone structure, much thicker than you would find on most humans other than in a place like the pelvis. Let's see if I can get another cut from the other side, but it's probably going to collapse. And again, the sword suffered no damage. It feels like there's a bone here. I'm going to try a middle haul and just come at it like this and see if I can cut into it that way. There's going to be significantly less resistance, so I don't expect it to go as far in. And again, that was about 30 to 40% power. All right. Yeah, so at 30 to 40% power, we can see that it was absolutely able to cut through. We've got about 4.5 centimeters worth of bone. You can see the different layers of bone, so you can get the kind of pinkish marrow. You've got the external, the different structures escape me for right now. But here, let's see if I can pull it out. I'm not going to be able to pull it out, so I'm not sure exactly what head. This might be a shank, so we might be looking at the tibia and the fibula here, and the two different structures of the lower leg. Okay. Nice showing from the messer. And just to revisit, absolutely no damage at all on the messer edge. It's held up astoundingly well. And just so you can hear it, this isn't, even though it's been cooked, listen to it. Oh. So just so you can hear it, it's all hard bone. There's obviously some connective tissue and cartilage in spots, but that's still hard despite its cooking. I'm going to switch to a bigger sword and see if we can't give it a big wallop. Okay, so I wanted to try this instead. So Skallagrim had previously tested this gen against a synthetic hand, and he was very surprised that it cut so well against a synthetic target that had fake bones inside of it, because it's reasonably narrow, it's not super heavy, it's a single-handed gen from the Han Dynasty, but it's diamond cross-sectioned, it's very sharp, it does round a little bit, so it's not completely flat. It has some reinforcement towards the tip, even though it doesn't have a secondary bevel, but it is very sharp, and it's pretty long, so it's got a lot of leverage. So I am going to give this a big chop, and we'll see what happens. All right, so the string broke, and I hit it lower, so I cut my string. And even though this is a much narrower sword than the longest messer, take a look at the cut we were able to yield. So I cut through an upper bone, and then very, very, very deep into a lower bone structure here. Yeah, I think that this will probably just snap apart if I push too hard. There's a very heavy bone structure back here. I'm wondering if there's two bones here. It might be that this is one bone It feels like this is the juncture of one bone and that this is another one down here. I might end up debrading it afterwards just so I can see what the anatomy is. I'm wondering if this is a joint, like I have if this is like an ankle or something. It's kind of interesting. I really wish I knew what I was looking at. Usually I'm so good at anatomy, even if it's non-human, but can't quite make it out this time. I really feel like, is this a patella here? I think that I have a pig's knee. Is that true? Do they sell pig knee? If so, then this here is the hardest part to cut through. I'll bring one last sword out to give it a whack. All right, there's only a little bit of meat left, but we're going to go full beans with a katana. I want to see what happens. There's a very large bony structure here. I suspect it's a joint, and I suspect that there's multiple bony structures here. I'm going to end up probably having to take all this meat off and see what the actual bones look like afterwards. So maybe I'll boil it or something like that. But very interesting. Let's see what happens if the katana hits it. Don't swing. All right. So needless to say, a high-powered katana strike had no difficulty going through the very, very heavy bone there, and as suspected, it suffered no difficulties from the ordeal. And so, just so you can see, here's how clean a cut it was able to render going through very large pieces of bone. So these bones, their diameter is larger than my thumb at this point. Well, that was something a little bit different. I don't know that I'll be able to do this too often, but my understanding is these cuts of meat are not that expensive. I don't want to really be wasteful, so if I can convince the wife that maybe we're going to have some ham for the week and she lets me maybe cut a piece of ham in two prior to cooking, I don't know if that's culinarily sound, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can split the ham in two with a properly cleaned sword and we can get some data out of it prior to eating. Anyway, here's something worth considering. Until next time, guys, take care. Let's see if I can get that last piece down. No spinning, no spinning. Don't spin. Much smaller strike. Top! Yep. Down she went. All right, so it turns out that the joint that I had was actually a knee joint. You can see how deeply the initial CASA type cuts that were coming from diagonal dug into. This is the distal head of the femur of the pig. We had one end that we completely transected this anterior part of the joint on this end here. So we have, this is the femur side, this is the tibia side. The tibia side doesn't seem to have suffered quite as much. There was also a patella, so this is the kneecap of it, and the kneecap was kind of heavily covered in tissue. It got split and cut in several places. Again, very clean cuts all the way through all of the rather heavy bone. So very, very happy with what I was able to learn. There was a strike towards the end that cleanly clove through the kind of proximal end of the femur here, although you can see that there's a little bit of chipping and shattering. I think that resulted in some of the edge rolling I saw on the katana at the end, but that was a kind of weak cut against a free-flowing target, which is why it was not as clean as some of these other much more substantial cuts were. So that's what the results of the first cut. Again, bits of the patella, bits of the femur, and then the tibia and fibula looked like they were basically not involved in any of the action. There may be one strike that just shaved a little bit of the proximal end of the head of the tibia.